the narrative on the economic growth, how does it pan out from your perspective? I mean, one way of looking at it is that India is doing relatively much better than the rest of the world. As I said, our neighborhood is in deep trouble, Europe is in trouble, and going forward, India also will have to revise the growth levels that we have Karan mentioned. But is it good enough, or there would be, in the political narrative, a key challenge in saying and convincing the electorate that we truly have a formidable story in the economic growth perspective?
So if you look at the GVA numbers a little more closely, you would find that the trade, hospitality, and the communication sector recorded the highest growth of 14% during this year, and the next high growth was in construction, which is about 10%. These two sectors make up more than 1/3 of the total gross value added. And if they have grown at such hefty rates, the contribution to the GVA growth of 7% by these two sectors is more than half. That is what makes when you generalize the impact on the population, on the people, and also in comparison to the other countries. The construction sector is largely, the growth is because of the heavy government capital investment in railways and roads, as well as also in a little bit in the housing sector. So these sector is driving. If you continue to do that kind of expenditure in these sectors, perhaps this will continue to grow, but the rest of the sectors are not seeing any extraordinary growth, which to me makes us sit and think about how to turn those sectors around. This global comparison business I find a little nauseating, in fact, if I can put it this way. There is no comparison between India and the US and the EU and all. They are the high income countries, $50,000, $60,000. We are struggling at $2,000, $2,400 per capita income. They don't have to grow. Their population stopped growing. They are actually not needing much of the growth. Whereas we, who are living in real poverty and poor quality of life in that sense, need to grow. So we should compare with the Vietnams and Indonesias and some of the other developing countries which are growing, rather than comparing and being satisfied about the EU or the US growth. Chinese growth rate also sometimes is presented in a very wrongful way. China did not have a negative growth in the COVID year of 2020. That was the one country which never had a negative growth. We sunk 6% in 1 year, and we had to make up. So that make-up growth should not be considered as something which is very high growth. So and then you see the 9% which came up year before is down to 7% or so. If we are losing momentum in times to come, and as everyone projects that next year the growth might be 6% or a little around that, less or more, then perhaps we are again getting onto the trajectory which indicates that after normalization, our normal growth, long-term normal growth, if it is 5 or 6% or lower, then I'm worried. I don't think that's a great thing to be. We have to grow at 8-9% or so to bring our population, our country to a reasonable level of life. We shouldn't be satisfied and happy about that we are growing better than EU countries or US.
All right.
Karan is there or is left?
Hey, Karan is there.
Karan, interesting.
I wanted to come in here because any serious person who studies growth would dare never say that growth process is independent of advanced economies, because those are the countries with real purchasing power that drives a lot of discretionary spending, which flows through in emerging market economies. So anyone who says that we don't need to look at growth in the US, EU, or that we have decoupled or emerging markets have decoupled, I wouldn't take that, to be a very good assessment to begin with. And as far as the question about, growing at 8% is concerned, I think, a lot of these things make a lot of sense when you say it in media, but when you sit down to work with actual data, with, empirical stuff, whether that's Clem's data or whatever, you realize that 8% was never a stable growth rate for India to begin with. And India's high growth years coincided with high global growth years, even during the 2006 to 2009 phase, and that sort of growth is no longer happening in the global economy. So the next question is that if the global economy is going to grow at 2 percentage points less, if China is going to grow at half the rate that it grew in the first decade of this century, then where will that additional external growth come for to be able to grow at say seven and a half rates above 7.5%? So I think serious commentators should be a bit careful before they kind of make these kind of comments, because they lead a lot of confusion. They create an aspiration which is very difficult to meet, and they also lead to a lot of policy errors in due course, which lead to unsustainable growth. So I think we have to be a bit careful there, and also on China, there's a lot of evidence emerging that a lot of the statistics that they've pushed over the last 2 decades uh, have been actually overestimating growth process per se. So I wouldn't take the numbers that come out of China at the moment very seriously, and I don't think anyone else should either, till there's greater transparency in the way they compute their national accounts.
Interesting, Karan. I mean, I think the best part is that the India economic growth story merits a debate at the most transparent level, and that's what distinguishes us from China. Because even on China, the first quarter calendar data is 4.5%, so we have bettered them on that count. Personally, I think my bet is on we are.
I think Mr. Garg wants to come in and respond to
okay,
respond to
that's
respond to
as the healthy tradition of democracy,
Absolutely.
we must bring in Mr. Garg.
I think this, what Karan said, I respect his assessment and his way of thinking. And it is also true that a lot of countries actually had grown when the developed countries like US, etc., had a high demand growth. They grow, as we call the export-oriented growth stories, whether it was Taiwan, Japan or South Korea, and later even China. But please remember, the times are never same. The times when the developed world or the advanced industrialized world was growing at higher growth rates and was increasing in demands are gone. And when that demand goes out, the only way you can actually take advantage of their larger economies, and even today, U.S. economy with 23, 24 trillion, the EU economy another 17, 18 trillion dollar, is that you can compete out somebody else. Because if there is no increasing demand to supply your goods and services, then you can't. And that is where for the new times, for the change time, you have to look for new strategies. There is a enormous growth in the demand globally, including in advanced countries, about services, but not manufacturing. So either you accept a situation that we are dependent too much on the traditional growth of the advanced countries, and if they don't grow, we will not grow. Or you have one of the two strategies, or both of them, that you grow the domestic economy to grow, which the China is also doing of late. And secondly, you become so competitive that you substitute the others' exports and others to gain share. For example, let me give you one example: electronics sector. After the Chinese manufacturing is being shifted, by US and other countries to sort of safeguard themselves from the dependence on one country, we are not able to capture much of that demand. Vietnam today exports 15 times more than the electronics which we do. We have touted and shouted all over about our mobile manufacturing, but if you look at the real value addition, which is the gain from the economic point of view, the real value addition is actually very small if you compare that with competing countries like Vietnam. So I think while we can't depend, but we will have to have the external demand to push our growth, but we can't really be relying only on that, and we can't be relying on the wrong strategies to capture that demand and expecting that
Okay.
if it emerges, then we will do it.
Okay, I think Karan wants to respond and then we'll have to quickly wrap up.
Yeah.
Okay, so two quick points. I think it's good to see Mr. Garg concede that 8% is of course a very challenging and aspirational growth, given the fact that global growth is going to be slowing. So I think we're on the same page there. But as far as his comments about Vietnam and you see when supply chains are shifting, of course Vietnam, Indonesia had a head start because they've been in this game for quite longer and they're much more efficient in terms of attracting investments, and a lot of that competitiveness actually happened when Mr. Garg was still in the government. I think he should probably, he's better in a position to explain why we didn't do stuff that we should have done at that point. But moving beyond, the point about adding less value at the moment, even with what we are doing, that's typically how industrial policy, operates, because you kind of create capacity at assembling to begin with, and then once you have enough domestic assembling or domestic value addition, even at the lower value added part of the service being done in an economy, right, that kind of creates scope for further downstream industries to come in. And what we see happening in at least the case of mobile phones, particularly in the case of Apple, is exactly that. First, we went into just simply getting SKDs and assembling, and now there's a lot of downstreaming of the investment activity also happening. So my humble submission here is that let's not hurry into comparing us with Vietnam and Indonesia when we are late to the game. Let's not compare to China, because again, there also we are late to the game by at least a decade. Give it some time, and then you might have a better assessment of which policies have worked and which policies haven't. Premature assessments and course correction without giving a policy full time to show its effect is only going to do more damage to our growth process than any benefit. So we must be conscious and cognizant of this fact.